Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to make a couple of videos here for you this week to touch on some of the finer points and some of the more difficult points, honestly, in the measurements of GDP and also unemployment. And so this one's about GDP and some of the material that you were presented last week and took an assessment on this week. I wanted to go over a couple of things that are important points but are sometimes hard to miss. And the first one is really just the concept of what GDP is. And so you guys know that GDP stands for gross domestic product, right? So I think you guys know that pretty well. So GDP is gross domestic product. But really, what it's attempting to do, the reason why we have this statistic is we're trying to keep track or we're trying to measure how much economic activity is taking place in the country. This is important for politicians, for policymakers, for bankers, investors, businesses, to try to get a sense of the health of the economy. What direction is it moving in? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? And so it's some good insight into how things are going. And I want to start by just touching on the definition of GDP. So the definition of GDP is the market value of all final goods and services. I'm going to abbreviate that, goods and services, produced in a country in a year. So there's a lot to unpack here. The market value, for example, here we're talking about the price of the product. And essentially, it's the price of the product based on how much it did sell for or is expected to sell for. So that's the market value. If something isn't sold, we have no way of knowing. If something is not sold at all, say, for example, you mow your yard, we don't really have a good way of capturing the market value, so we don't even count that. So we really only count things that are bought and sold. We're also looking at final goods and services. So final has to do with the fact that this is the last time that this product is going to be sold before it's finally used by the consumer or the end user, they say. So this is final is as opposed to intermediate. So an intermediate good, as you know, is something that is used in the making of something else, right? So it's a lot of times the raw materials that are used to make something. So if you're going to make a glass, for example, a company that makes glasses, they have to purchase sand, I assume, which is then heated up and melted and ultimately turned into glass. So the sand would be considered an intermediate good. We wouldn't really count the price of the sand or the amount that the glass company paid for when they purchased the sand, because I think it's safe to assume that whatever price is charged for this glass includes the value of the sand. So we don't count intermediate goods because it's captured in the price of that glass. The next thing we're looking at here is produced. So produced as opposed to consumed. Consumed, as you know, is the term we use for purchasing something. And so let me just illustrate why we are measuring production and not necessarily consumption. So I'm going to try to draw a little sketch here. Let's see if you can figure out what this is. There you go, not too bad. So hopefully you can guess that's the United States. And I just want to illustrate something. We're measuring the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country. So if we're thinking about the United States, we want to know about the value of everything produced in this country. Well, why do we focus on production and not necessarily consumption? And here's why. So say this is a real simplification here, but let's say we have a person. We'll put them right here close to where we live, maybe. So this individual, let's say, purchases a new car. So there's a factory maybe down here in Arizona or something like that, and this factory produces a car. And this person here purchases that car. So we'll make a little flow of money or something, maybe $30,000. So that's $30,000 in money flowing that direction. And then, of course, they get the car. So the car goes that way. So that's a purchase of a vehicle. And the $30,000 would be recorded as part of our GDP. But really, it's the reason why we're recording that is because we're recording the fact that that car was made here in this country. So this person might also purchase maybe a new furnace. And maybe that furnace was made up here near Toronto in Canada. And so that furnace is going to be sent to this gentleman if he purchases it. And he's going to have to send some money to the company that made the furnace. Maybe he'll purchase a $3,000 furnace. So $3,000 goes here to a company in Toronto, and the furnace comes here into the United States, and this gentleman puts it into his house. So this gentleman just spent $3,000 to buy a furnace. He also spent $30,000 to buy a car. But we wouldn't say that the GDP of the United States is both 30,000 and 3,000. We wouldn't say it's 33,000 because this furnace was not made in the United States. So we're going to keep track of all the production, the car, but not the consumption or the purchasing. Side note, bonus question for you. Where would the $3,000 furnace be counted? And that would be in the GDP of Canada, right? It would be counted in the GDP of Canada because it's produced in Canada. So that's just a little note on GDP that I wanted to point out. A second and maybe a little bit more difficult concept is the idea of GDP versus real GDP. And I want to illustrate this with a little example. So this is a real simplification, but I want to maybe provide 2 years in time and a very simplified example here. So, but this is a microcosm or a little peek at how GDP is calculated. Let's assume here for the country of the United States that the U.S. Literally only makes 2 different things. In reality, we produce hundreds of thousands of different types of things, but let's say we only produce 2 types of things. And sticking with the car theme, I'll say we make cars and we'll say computers. And the way that we're keeping track of GDP, the way we really tabulate GDP, it's pretty simple. And this is a real oversimplification. So you're just getting the sense of how we do this. We're going to count up the quantity of cars. I'm going to label that Q for quantity, the total number of cars that are produced in the country. And then we're going to measure what is the price of a car. Now, I know you're saying, well, there's a lot of different prices of cars. And again, that's an oversimplification. In reality, we'd have to look at all the different varieties of cars. And, we'd probably have hundreds of different types of cars being represented here. But this is just a simplification. So let's say in the year 2018, the United States produced a whopping total of 5 cars. That's all we produced, 5 cars. And let's say that these cars sold at a price of $20,000. And then for computers, let's say the country produced a quantity or a grand total of 100 computers, and that the computers sold for a price of $500. Right? So we'll get to 2019 here in a moment, but let's think about what's the GDP for this country in 2018. Calculating GDP is fairly simplistic when you think about it. We're literally just taking the quantity of the things we produced, in this instance 5 cars, multiplying by the price of the car, which is $20,000. So we're going to multiply these two, and we end up getting a total of 20,000 times 5. That's $100,000. So that's the total value of all the cars produced here in the country. We'll do the same for computers. 100 computers times $500 each. That would be $50,000. Okay. So $50,000 worth of computers and $100,000 worth of cars. So what's the total value of everything produced in the country? If it's just cars and computers, then it's as simple as $100,000 in cars plus $50,000 in computers. So we're going to add all this up. I'll just put this in parentheses. We're going to add those together, and we will get $150,000 worth of cars and computers, or we could say goods and services. So back to our definition up here, does this fit with what we've been talking about? GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. If cars and computers are the only things we produce in this country, and the price, the market value, the amount that it sells for is $20,000 for cars and $500 for computers, then indeed $150,000 would be the market value of all these final goods and services produced in a country in a year. So let's go ahead and make up some numbers for 2019. And I want to illustrate a point with this. So this isn't just another round of practice, but there's a bigger point here. Let's say that in the year 2019, our car production dropped off a little bit. So we only managed to produce 4 cars that year. But the price of cars did go up. And so cars were sold for $25,000. Okay. And for computers, let's say we were able to eke out a little bit more computer production. So we'll say 110 computers. And we'll say that the price of computers remained the same. So no change in the price of computers. So what's our market value of cars this year? $25,000 times 4 cars. That equals $100,000 worth of cars. And what's our market value of computers? 110 times 500. That is going to be $55,000 worth of computers. So if we add these together, we have $155,000 worth of goods and services produced in the year. So when we look at the GDP of 2018 and we see 150,000, and then the next year it's 155,000, the GDP went up. And so you could say the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year, in this country, increased from one year to the next. So we saw an increase in GDP. But we got to stop and think about that for a second. Why did it go up? Well, there's really only 2 possible explanations for why GDP can go up or go down from one year to the next. And that is either the quantity of cars and computers changed or the price of cars and computers changed. Well, which one was it? In this case, the quantity of cars went down and the quantity of computers went up. And the price of cars went up and the price of computers didn't change at all. So when we look at this number over here and we see that the GDP increased from 150,000 to 155,000, can we say when we look at that, just if we looked at this number, say we didn't have the opportunity to see these other numbers here, if we were just taking a look at these values over here, it would certainly appear as though this country is producing more goods and services in 2019 than it did in 2018. But we can't be sure of that because it's very possible that the reason this went up was because the price of goods and services went up. And frankly, the whole point of GDP, the whole purpose of GDP is to try to figure out how much economic activity is taking place in a country. We want to know about the amount of production. So what we really care about is the quantities. We care about the quantities. And the quantity of cars went down while the quantity of computers went up. Is that a wash? Do the two, one goes down and one goes up? Should they kind of offset each other? It's hard to say. It really depends on what the value of those things are. Let's think about this in a different context. Imagine our country produced not cars and computers, but let's say that our country produced cars, and what's something that is pretty insignificant? Let's say envelopes. Yeah? Let's say that we produce cars and envelopes. If our country produces one fewer cars, one less car, but it does make one more envelope, would you say our country is producing the same amount from one year to the next? Is one envelope worth the same as one car? Probably not. An envelope's pretty simple to make. It's not very, doesn't use a lot of resources, doesn't take a lot of labor, doesn't take a lot of effort, doesn't take a lot of money to make an envelope. So I don't think we can simply say if we produce fewer cars one year but more envelopes, our country is, doing just fine. So we really need to do something to measure the value of cars and computers, and that's why we include the price. The problem is prices change from year to year, and that sort of distorts this number. So that's where we come to this second term in GDP, and that is the idea of real GDP. And this is super important in economics. Frankly, it's more important than just GDP. Real GDP is the measurement of GDP that economists use when they're trying to compare an economy's performance in one year to an economy's performance in another year. If you want to know how is the economy doing today as compared to a year ago, you want to look at its real GDP, because we frankly don't care about prices. I know we do as consumers, but as economists, what we really care about is how much economic activity is taking place. What's happening to those quantities? So there's a very simple way to calculate real GDP that can eliminate the effect of prices changing over time. It's so simplistic. All we simply do is don't let the prices change over time. How do we do that? We are going to pick a so-called base year. A base year is a somewhat arbitrarily selected year, and the base year is the year from which we always take our prices. So all we want to do is have our prices remain the same for all time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to arbitrarily select 2018 as my base year. And to remind myself of that, I'm going to circle the price of cars in 2018, and I'm going to circle the price of computers in 2018. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to recalculate my GDPs in both years, but I'm going to only use the prices from 2018. So first, let's start with 2018. We're going to measure the quantity of cars in 2018, 5. And we're going to multiply that by the price of cars in 2018. Oh, look at that. It's 20,000 still. So this is all going to work out the same here. So $100,000 in cars. And then we're going to do the same for computers. And we'll use the price from 2018. And so we get $50,000 in computers. When we add together our values of cars and computers, yeah, of course, we get the same answer we had a few moments ago when we calculated GDP. Well, that's not very interesting. It's the same number. But that's because 2018 is our base year. That's the year that I arbitrarily selected to be my base year. And it turns out that GDP and real GDP will always be the same in the base year because they're using the same prices. But now let's go ahead and calculate real GDP for the year 2019. So here's how we do it. We take the quantity from the year that we're measuring, 2019, but we're going to use the price from the base year, this one up here that's circled. So 4 times 20,000 is $80,000. So what does that number mean? Well, in 2019, we only produced 4 cars, not 5. And if we use the value of a car from 2018, we see that the total value of cars that we produced was only $80,000 compared to $100,000 the year before. So what we can say is that the value of cars that we produced decreased from one year to the next, as long as we're clear that we're talking about as measured using 2018 prices. Sometimes you hear this in the news, if you listen carefully, you'll hear someone say, using 2018 dollars. They'll say something like that. the United States produced $80,000 in cars, measured in 2018 dollars. What they mean to say is we're taking the prices from that year. Let's do the same with computers. How many computers did we produce in 2019? 110. What was the price of computers in 2018? 500. Notice it didn't change, so our answer here should be the same, 55,000. So let's go ahead and add up our two subtotals, 80,000 plus 55,000. So 8 plus 5 is 130. This is 135,000. So now take a look at this. If we are looking at real GDP, it decreased from 150,000 to 135,000. So it turns out that our country, when we keep prices stable or constant, or you might say we adjust for inflation, we eliminate inflation, our country actually did worse from 2018 to 2019. Our real GDP decreased. And that's because we produced fewer cars, and cars are just so valuable that the fact that we produce fewer cars cannot be offset by producing just a little bit more computers. So I hope that makes some sense to you. The important note to take away here is that real GDP eliminates the effect of inflation. Real GDP cannot change from year to year due to inflation or price changes. The only thing that can change real GDP from one year to the next is a change in the quantity or the amount of goods and services that we produce.